Jesus said, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And as we've seen throughout this study, the way in which we as Christians live with one another is rooted in the ways in which we love one another. And this comes from God's love for us. Like, if God has loved us while we are still sinners and shown us his grace in the death and resurrection of Jesus, then our salvation is rooted in God's loving action toward us. We are saved by his grace. Therefore, when we as Christians live in loving action towards others, we testify to the truth that God has loved us when we were still sinners. We live by grace, which is why the way that we as Christians live is so vitally important to our worship of God. Because if you say that you love God and yet hate your brother, you're a liar. And so then, if you do truly love God, if you do truly worship God, if you have really been saved by his grace, then your life will be marked by a grace-driven effort to love your brother. This is why the one another commands are so crucial to the Christian life. They tell us how we as the Christian community are to live out the love of God. Today, I just want to see how this works in the action of bearing with one another. It comes from two places, Ephesians chapter 4 and Colossians chapter 3. Let me read for you Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Paul says, this is how you live as Christians. We display the love of God to a watching world by living in humility, gentleness, patience, he says, bearing with one another in love. Very similarly, over in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. So what exactly does Paul mean when he says we should bear with one another? Let me contrast that with a similar concept of tolerance. If we say we tolerate someone, in general what we mean is that there's something about them that we don't like or that we don't agree with, and therefore we tolerate them by moving away from them so that they can do their thing and we can do our thing and we won't get in each other's way. In a sense, then, tolerance is deliberately moving away from someone. To bear with someone, though, is to deliberately move toward them. So we have to acknowledge on the front of this that in the Christian community there are going to be differences, there are going to be conflicts, and there's going to be difficulties. And sometimes that can be a good thing when we divide over what is true. But for the most part, our conflicts are rooted not in matters of doctrine, but in matters of opinion. And so if you have a brother or sister in Christ, say, that you have an argument with, you have a responsibility to bear with them, to move toward them in love and strive for resolution. In the same way, if you don't like someone's personality, maybe they just get on your nerves, as a Christian, you do not have the option to simply ignore them. Instead, we ought to move toward them, to embrace them as a brother and sister in Christ. We need to labor to love them, to understand them, to have patience with them, to bear with them. And how can we possibly do that? Well, both Ephesians 4 and Colossians 2 tell us that this will require humility, gentleness, kindness, compassion, meekness, most importantly, love. So why exactly then would we move towards one another with such humility, gentleness, kindness, compassion, meekness, and love? Well, because for one, that's exactly what God has done for us. See, God doesn't tolerate our sin. He doesn't ignore it. He bears with our sin. First by sending Jesus to give us salvation, then by sending his Spirit and his word, God moves toward us, putting our sin to death. The second reason that we ought to treat one another in that way is that I have to recognize that I'm a sinner, that I need the love and patience of the Christian community. I need people who will bear with me in my sin, in my quirks, in my failings. And the result when we do this is that we will maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We will tell the watching world what the love of God is like by the way in which we bear with one another.